The Great Orchid Media Debate, episode 7 of our hotly debated orchid care topics. The question that we've all asked ourselves right from the beginning of our orchid journey to still now is, what media is going to be best for my orchids? Well, some growers will tell you bark is the best orchid media, whereas others will say sphagnum moss. And then again, we also get those other growers that will say Leca, and they'll even use those in semi-hydroponic systems, or even things like coir. With so many different options, let's break down the different viewpoints on this to make it easier for you to decide what's going to be the best media for your orchid. And welcome to the Nature Company. Today we're going to be looking at all those different media people use to pot up their orchids, and we'll go through the benefits and the drawbacks of each of these different types of media to help you decide better what is going to be best for your orchid. And at the end, we'll go through which orchids probably suit which media better to help make this decision easier. If this is the kind of information you are interested in, please hit that subscribe button down below if you haven't already, and that notification bell to be notified of all our upcoming content so you don't miss out on a thing. And I know initially looking at all the different options, it can seem like it's going to be a bit complicated, especially if you're having to take into account your climate, the environment you're growing in, your feeding and watering habits, and the specific type of orchid. We'll look at each of these different media individually to help give you the benefits and the drawbacks of each one of them that will help you make an easy decision as to what is going to be beneficial for your orchids. And we'll start off with one of the most common choices, bark. Bark chips are one of the most common media to grow orchids in. It's generally a fir or pine bark, as they tend to break down relatively slowly. And also, because of their irregular shapes, they provide a lot of aeration and fast drainage. So this makes them particularly useful in growing a lot of different types of orchids. Also, if you think out in nature, a lot of them are growing on the bark of trees anyway. So why not try and bring that component into your man-made home environment? So already we've started to mention some of those advantages that bark has. Those irregular shapes and sizes producing large air gaps in between it. Its firm nature provides a good structure so that those gaps don't really close up, and it can't really be compacted. So this allows for easy, fast drainage of your media, so you're not having stagnant water sitting in it. It will dampen your bark, but the balance of the water will flush straight through. So this will help prevent fungus and bacterial diseases, and also lessen the chance of root rot and drowning or suffocation of your roots from having too much water in the media all the time. Also, these bark pieces coming from pine and fir bark are generally just slightly acidic, which is often best for the majority of orchids. They like that slightly acidic environment that helps them absorb nutrients better. And another benefit of this type of bark is that it decays relatively slowly as compared to some of the other media such as sphagnum moss. So you're probably only going to need to be repotting every second, possibly every third year. Also, it is an excellent media for those warm, humid areas because of that air movement, those air gaps that it has in between it, allowing for air movement through, which also helps prevent fungal attacks. Now, some of the disadvantages with bark. That also relates to some of the advantages. Because of all that air movement and air gaps, bark can dry out particularly quickly. And this can cause desiccation to your orchid if you're not watering frequently enough. And if you need to water frequently, what's going to happen is your bark will start to decompose faster. And as that decomposition takes place, it will fill up all those air gaps with rotting material, and that will then suffocate your roots. It will also start holding too much moisture, which will then rot your roots. And also, the acidity levels increase as it starts to decompose, becoming problematic for your plants. And one other disadvantage is bark has a very low capacity for holding nutrients. So those nutrients could just flush out as you are feeding your plant without allowing for any residual nutrients in the media to help feed your plant over longer periods. So when looking at bark, generally, it's probably one of the better medias for your warm, humid climates. And later we'll get into what orchids bark media suits the best. The second most frequently used media for orchid growth is sphagnum moss. These long strands of sphagnum moss are excellent for growing certain types of orchids in. They hold a lot of moisture and are light, fluffy and airy with lots of air gaps in between. So ideal for growing certain orchids in. So what are some of the advantages of using sphagnum moss? Well, sphagnum moss is generally neutral in pH, so it's not going to affect the uptake of nutrients like a very acidic or a very alkaline media might. Also, the fact that it holds so much moisture. It really does absorb a lot of water as you are watering, and it holds it in it for a long time. So this is going to help provide not only humidity for your plant as the moisture may slowly evaporate around your orchid, but it's also going to supply water for it for longer periods as it does not dry out so quickly. And the water that it does absorb will be available to the plant over a long period of time. And also being so light, fluffy and easy to use, it actually makes it ideal for rooting damaged orchids in. It gives them the right sort of environment with the air movement plus humidity and moisture available to the plant to help it root faster. So it's particularly good in those cases where you have orchids that have damaged root systems to rehabilitate them. So again, the disadvantages of sphagnum moss can also be related to the advantages. Because it holds so much moisture, it can hold too much for your orchid if you are not controlling your watering. It makes it incredibly easy to overwater your orchids and drown the roots. And with it having such a light, fluffy nature, it can tend to compact quite easily as soon as it's overwatered. And as that happens, you land up with patches in the center that are going to hold tremendous amounts of water that will then cause problems for your plant. This could make fungal and bacterial diseases thrive, especially in those warmer, humid climates. Also, another problem with sphagnum moss is the rate at which it decomposes. Depending on how often you need to water, you may find you'll have to repot your orchid every year. But with the use of sphagnum moss, it can be quite easy to do then, and it can cause very little stress to your orchid as long as you're keeping your media soft and fluffy. Also, if you leave your media in too long, as it decomposes, it's going to get really acidic really quickly, which will be detrimental to your orchid. So the majority of the time, sphagnum moss is used with another ingredient such as pine bark that's going to provide the structure, and the sphagnum moss will then supply the moisture holding quality for the media. With that, you can see why sphagnum moss is probably a good idea for those hotter, drier climates where perhaps you're not watering as frequently, and it's allowing for that extra moisture to your plant for longer periods while still providing it that little bit of extra humidity for the plant itself. Leca is another commonly used media for growing orchids now. A lot of people are now doing semi-hydro with Leca to grow certain orchids with. But we'll just give a hint into that a little bit just now. First, we'll look at what are the advantages of using Leca. Leca is basically expanded clay that has been rolled into round balls and then fired at extremely high temperatures. And this provides a fairly even structure throughout your media with large sized air gaps in between your rounded media. This provides excellent drainage and aeration for your orchids. So it's going to allow that water to rush straight through and give your orchids those wet, dry cycles that a lot of them like. So what are the exact benefits of using Leca as a media? Firstly, they have an EC component. This is electroconductivity. This means they can hold nutrients for longer than something like bark. Also, what this does is it allows for watering from the base. By placing them in a tray of water, the water can flow up around those beads of Leca and become available to the surface. They'll draw water upwards as evaporation takes place from the top of the Leca. This means they can move moisture around the media itself, making it an ideal media for your orchid so that all parts of the root system will be able to get moisture. So we have the good drainage, the good aeration, and the ability to retain nutrients that can feed the plant over a period of time. So what are the disadvantages of this? Well, the fact that it will dry out incredibly quickly. What will happen, especially if you're not putting it in a tray of moisture, is as evaporation takes place, it will draw all that moisture straight out of the media through the top of the plant, and you won't have any moisture left. So you'll have to ensure that you are watering frequently. But if you are doing a semi-hydro, then you are sitting this in a small tray of water and allowing for that water to be continually drawn up. But this is not something that all orchids will take to. Only certain orchids will grow particularly well in this sort of setup, and a lot of them take a very long time to adapt to it. So it can be quite a difficult transition for your orchids from growing in a normal media to growing in a semi-hydroponic situation. And as I said, not all orchids are suited to that type of growing. And also with Leca being an inorganic media, it's not going to break down. So that means you're going to have to repot very seldom, if at all, depending on whether your orchid outgrows the container or not. But always remember, if growing in Leca, your humidity levels are going to be important. So you may have to supply extra humidity to your plants with a humidifier or by some other means. And in the same vein, other media that can be used in much the same way as Leca is broken pieces of brick, shards of terracotta pots. Any of these things are also very good media to use for certain types of orchids because they supply that great structure to the media, allowing for air spaces to always be present because no compaction can take place. And your media does not decompose in any way, so it's not going to cause any threat to your plant in that form. But items such as your pieces of clay brick and clay terracotta pots are not going to be allowing water to move around them in the same way as what Leca does. But they do still absorb a certain amount of water, making it a slow release system. They do absorb nutrients, allowing for slow release of nutrients too. But always remember, with these types of media as well, if you are feeding frequently, flush, 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 excess nutrients can build up on these really quickly because they'll hold those nutrients, and then as the air dries them incredibly quickly, salt deposits will settle onto the surface. So that can then start causing salt buildups for your plant, which can then be problematic for the roots. And other inorganic media, such as charcoal, can also be used very successfully. Be sure to go have a check at our charcoal video, which we'll link somewhere here, or just put it down in the description box below so you can have a look at our charcoal video and how to use it for your orchids. And before I forget, on about inorganic media, things like styrofoam can be excellent additions to your media, especially if you're trying to keep your pots light by putting it down at the base of the pot. It provides structure by providing air gaps in between it. Please don't go out and buy new polystyrene to do this. All you're doing is destroying the environment itself. Rather, reuse old polystyrene that might go into the tip anyway. That's going to just become landfill. Use it at landfill in your orchids. At least it's getting a second life and being used again. Please recycle, reuse, repurpose. So let's get back to some of the more natural things. Coco coir. This is something that's been used in the East for a long, long time, for many generations, but it's only finding popularity now in the West after a long time, especially now that they've come up with these different forms of being able to use it. This makes it a lot easier to use in the format that we used to into pots. So these coir chunks, these provide a nice moisture retaining media with that aeration that will provide moisture for long periods for your plant while still allowing excess water to then drain out. So the benefits of coir are not only your aeration and the moisture retaining qualities of it, but also that ability to hold the nutrients for much longer periods than what a bark media can do. And then it can make it slowly available to the plant. It's also, as I said, much more eco-friendly than your sphagnum moss and a lot less expensive. It's generally relatively easy to get in most parts of the world, as it is basically a byproduct of coconuts. It's that husk on the outside of your coconut. So again, those disadvantages can be the same as your advantages again. It's always that, is that the amount of moisture it holds can be problematic if you start overwatering. So it's good for hot, dry climates where you may not be able to keep up with the watering of your plant, that this can then help you sustain moisture in your plant for longer periods. Also, the fact that it can decompose quickly, especially if you're keeping it moist all the time, it can decompose quite quickly. You may have to repot every single year when using these coir chunks. There are larger coir slabs available in certain parts of the world that will last longer, but with these, when put into a pot, if kept moist all the time, will actually decompose quite quickly. And again, cause an acidic environment, which is detrimental to your plant. Also, the moisture retaining qualities will go up, leaving a soggy, damp mess in your pot, which will rot all your roots. And another big factor you have to take into account when using coir is that a lot of it is grown near the oceans. So there's often a large salt content in your coir chunks from the production areas that they come from. So they are going to have to be rinsed several times to ensure that you get all that excess salt out of them before you actually use it. That becomes especially pertinent when you're growing orchids that are sensitive to excess salts like cattleyas. And now that you have a good basic idea of what the different medias will supply to your plant and the deficiencies they have, it gives you an idea of how you can start mixing them together and blending them in a way that's going to suit your orchids and the environment you're in, along with your watering and feeding habits. So you can ensure that you get the perfect media for the way you're treating your orchids. There are also a lot of other additives available, such as vermiculite, perlite, and even some growers use a coco peat for their orchids that need a lot of moisture all the time. So by combining these different media in different ways, you can provide a lot of different root environments for your orchids so that they can all grow happily in the same climate or environment that you are particularly growing them in. This will give you the ability to grow a wider range of orchids than you might initially have thought possible. So now let's have a look at what orchids will suit what media best. We'll start off with bark. Because it's got such good drainage and aeration, you want to put things in that like those fast wet dry cycles, like your cattleyas, your phalaenopsis, your oncidiums. All of them will do particularly well in a bark media, especially in those hot, humid climates. And your sphagnum moss, because it has the ability to hold so much water, you want to look at things like Miltoniopsis, Paphiopedilums, and even your phalaenopsis seedlings that need a lot of moisture because they are growing incredibly quickly. The nice aerated, moist media is going to help them grow well. And with media such as your Leca and your other inorganic media, you want those orchids that like to get particularly dry after watering. So things like your cattleyas, even some of your dendrobiums that really like to absorb moisture quickly and then be dry afterwards to avoid root rot. Then these inorganic media are ideal. So as you pour the water through, it runs through, wets the roots, keeps a bit of humidity in and around the roots for a while the balance of the water drains out. And then the air movement allows even the center of the pot to dry out well, to ensure you have the perfect environment to grow these orchids. And with something like semi-hydro, then you probably want to use Leca with with something like your Phalaenopsis. But that's a completely different deal, and we'll have to deal with that in another video. And then your coir. Because of its high moisture retaining qualities, it's used often for growing things like your Paphiopedilums, your Mastivalias, and even those Miltoniopsis. They like to be kept moist all the time so that they can keep growing throughout the year. And just one other consideration when using Leca. Because of that evaporation that takes place all the time from the surface, especially if you're growing semi-hydro and it's continually drawing moisture up through the media, understand you're getting evaporative cooling throughout your media. So you have to be careful when using Leca on certain plants, especially if you're growing them semi-hydro, because that evaporative cooling can be quite detrimental to some of your orchids and they will not acclimatize. So if you are looking to use inorganic media that doesn't have such a cooling effect on your plants when watering, then use things like your clay bricks or your shards of terracotta pots. Anything along those sorts of lines and lava rock. I nearly forgot lava rock. Lava rock is also an excellent media that allows for that fast drainage. It holds that little bit of moisture to allow for a little bit of humidity around it, that fast drainage, but also remember, as soon as you're using these medias, they dry out incredibly quickly. Be sure that you're vigilant and have a vigorous enough watering regime to overcome the drying that may happen. And if I've missed anything, please shout at me in the comments. When I go through these videos, often there's little things I miss out here and there. So don't be shy, just get to me, tell me what I've missed and how I've said it wrong. Ed posts up a lot of content in that Buy Me a Coffee link that is in the description down there below. Go have a look. There's a lot of information available there for everyone to check out, as long as some members only content. So don't be shy, sign up, become a member, and grow like a pro. If you find any of this content helpful, please hit that like button, hit that subscribe button down below, and that notification bell, bing bong, to be notified of all our upcoming content so you don't miss out on a thing. Help us grow as we help your orchids grow.